This podcast is brought to you by the American Enterprise Institute.
If you like what you hear, please subscribe, rate, review, and share.
Thanks for listening. Here's our show.
What in the hell's going on?
What the hell is going on?
What the hell is going on?
I don't know what the hell he's talking about.
You don't have to know what the hell is on it.
What the hell's the matter with these guys?
We don't know what's going on.
What the hell's going on?
Who in God's name knows what it's all about?
Hi, I'm Danielle Pletka.
And I'm Mark Thiessen.
Welcome to our podcast, What the Hell is Going On? Mark, what the hell is going on? What the hell have you been doing?
Well, so we did a podcast recently where we featured an event that you held where you excluded me and interviewed two brilliant congressmen, Richie Torres and Mike Lawler, about the problem of anti-Semitism. And so today I'm getting you back because I had a great event at AEI with two congressmen, a Republican and Democrat, Congressman John Moolenaar and Congressman Raja Krishnamurthy, who are the chairman and ranking member of the House Select Committee on the Strategic Competition with the Chinese Communist Party. And it was a great event where I learned so much. And so we're going to bring
great.
It was a terrific event. And what we talked about are shipping cranes. Now, why should we be concerned about shipping cranes? Because it turns out that China controls 80% of the shipping cranes in the ports across the east and west coast of the United States. And not only that, they've installed cellular towers in the shipping cranes, which allows them to control those shipping cranes from Beijing and Shanghai and China. So we've got literally China has the ability with the flip of a switch to shut down our ports in a crisis over, say, Taiwan or some other situation. If this isn't like the epitome of everything that we've done wrong with our China trade policy over the last quarter century, I don't know what is.
So I have a deeply intellectual intervention here, which is that when Olivia and Sophie and Nikki were small, they watched a really great cartoon that was one of those cartoons that was written for kids, but also for adults so that you could enjoy it too, called Kim Possible. Mm-hmm. And the bad guy is Dr. Draken. And at a certain moment, they did a movie-length version of it, and the evil guys took over this obvious sort of like McDonald's type company and had Happy Meals and gave away a toy with every meal. And each toy was controlled at the headquarters of the company. And then when they had enough out there in the world, they activated them and took over the country. And my feeling is this is what China is doing to us.
It's literally true. It's not just shipping containers. I mean, it is in all areas, in telecommunications and pharmaceuticals, and they've been hacking into our banking system, into our water system.
DNA?
DNA, that's right. They have a company that's stolen DNA. And so we got a situation where, okay, let's pull back for a second and look at the bigger picture. So we're now like at about a quarter century since Congress approved permanent normal trade relations for the PRC and paved the way for China getting into the WTO, and resulted in a dramatic expansion of trade between the United States and China, a dramatic expansion of investment. And the hope at the time was trade was going to democratize China, right? That it would create incentives for the Chinese Communist Party to open up its society, to play by the rules. And instead, the opposite has happened. They've become more repressive, not less. They've used their access to our trade and investment to steal our intellectual property and use that wealth to build up their military. Instead of becoming a force for liberalization, U.S. corporations have become foreign agents for the Chinese Communist Party, like lobbying in Congress against bills banning slave labor. And we've become dependent on China for telecommunications, pharmaceuticals, all these strategic areas of interest. And now we're finding out that all these investments that we've allowed China to make and all these things we've become dependent on, they're Trojan horses. They've inserted themselves into our supply chains, and these things are lying in wait, ready to be activated in case of a war between our two countries, where they can attack us from within. We've allowed Trojan horses into our country through these Chinese companies, and it's a serious threat to our country.
So, look, I think it's important to understand that when this fight began, and we're talking now about well over a decade and a half ago, there were a few members of Congress, and we should call out our good friend Senator John Kyle from Arizona, who really was one of the leaders in doing this about Huawei, the telecommunications company that is now well known to be a backdoor, building backdoors throughout the world, and wherever it is installing telecom equipment, backdoors back to Beijing for control, for listening, for information, for everything else. But it is not crazy that there were some, particularly economists, who had doubts about this. And I want to explain why. Oftentimes there will be protectionists who hide behind the idea that foreign companies are somehow dangerous to us, right? And therefore we should protect our own industry. And that's a terrible excuse. And I love the fact that these guys were like, well, no, I mean, we don't care if they're, the Chinese are selling ramen here, that's fine. Although ramen is Japanese, isn't it? I don't know. It may not be.
Probably made in China too.
Well, that's also true. But the reality is this is not a protectionist head fake. And we recently had this fight internal to AEI where these sort of super First Amendment extremist libertarians were saying, no, prove to us the malign influence of TikTok. And I was like, oh my God, prove to me it doesn't have malign influence. But there is a real problem with explaining this. And what I loved about this event is that these guys were very specific about which companies were doing this, how they were doing it, what the right response was, and how we need to, in fact, be vigilant. I also think it's really critical that they explain to our audience, and now our podcast audience will hear it as well, just how damn much it costs us to retrofit everything that the Chinese have installed with a surveillance back door. Whether it's the 80% of cranes that exist in the United States, or it was the Huawei equipment, or it's ZTE, or whatever else it is.
We're talking tens of billions of dollars per industry, and that's just to get started. And on top of that, also, in a lot of these things, we don't have the capability. I don't think we have a domestic crane manufacturing base in our country, and so you have to create it from scratch, which is not easy to do. And we don't have a lot of friends and allies around the world who friendly countries who make these things. So what we have done is systematically. I don't care who makes my ramen. I don't care who makes my T-shirts. Though why not Vietnam instead of China? They're both communists, but at least one likes America, right? I don't care who makes those, but I do care who makes my pharmaceuticals. I do care who makes my telecommunications. I do care who makes my shipping cranes. There's a whole vast network of strategic areas where we have become completely dependent on our adversary. And it's insanity. And so maybe it's not backdoor protectionism, but from a national security standpoint, the people who were opposed to this, including our old boss, Jesse Helms, who fought PNTR for China and was right, have been vindicated because it's ideal. Look, it's an ideal. If you just look at it from a pure free market standpoint, go to Milton Friedman and all of his arguments in favor of a complete open free trade, it makes perfect economic sense. But it doesn't make national security sense to just get the cheapest possible widgets when those widgets are essential for your national security. And it doesn't always make political sense when you're exporting millions of jobs outside the United States and it's dislocating people in our country. So I think there's a right move to find a balance here where we do still trade and have free and fair trade on the world stage, but we also protect certain industries that we need for our national security that we can't be dependent on other countries for.
But I also think, Mark, I think that's completely right. And I also think that the thing that, I wrote a piece about this, God, years ago now, but I stand by it, which is that we need to have something like we had during the Cold War, which was COCOM. COCOM was a trading system, mostly for munitions and dual-use goods, but COCOM was for the good guys, the non-Soviets, right? And so, if you were an ally of the Soviet Union, you weren't in there. It was basically a trading trust circle. And that's what we need now. We need
love that
two
idea.
tiers. Right. It was a good idea at the time. It's still a good idea. I'll find you the article and
Like a
send
NATO
it to
for
you.
trade.
Yeah. But I mean, we need that because, as you rightly say, we don't want to get back in the business of making TVs or cranes necessarily, but we want to at least be able to have a virtuous circle of non-communist countries. And you're right, Vietnam is communist, but at least a reliable trading partner. Non-communist countries where we can actually reliably source important national security implicated goods that we're buying.
Countries where the leaders don't wake up every day and think America's what's wrong with the world is the standard. Another Rumsfeldism that you will love. The other thing we've completely forgotten because we used your what was the cartoon again?
Oh, Kim Possible.
So we used your Kim Possible example, but there's an even better example of this, which is Israel's infiltration in the supply chain of Hezbollah to create these exploding pagers and exploding walkie-talkies. I mean, we've all been transfixed by the way the supply chain was manipulated in order to carry out those attacks. If the good guys can do it, the bad guys can do it.
Yeah,
and literally what Israel has done to Hezbollah, China is actively doing to us right now. That's the danger.
I agree. Listen, I mean, I think this is a shame on us situation. We have not been vigilant enough. We have not been serious enough about giving an edge to our adversaries. And as you explain it in the event, totally correctly, and just now, we did it with the best possible motives, and we never really wanted to say that didn't work, right? We don't like to say, hey, actually, tying China up in the rules-based global system didn't work. Just like
it actually may go down as one of the greatest strategic errors in the history of our country.
Well, Henry Kissinger is dead now, so he won't be able to mourn that. But we can say the same about the United Nations, Mark. Remember the work that Brett Schaefer and I did about the Chinese domination of the United Nations? There's going to come a moment when we simply have to say, you know what? This organization is starting to do more harm than good. And that doesn't mean you throw the baby out with the bathwater. You want alliances. You want free trade wherever you can have it. You want trading arrangements wherever you can have them because that makes goods cheaper for the American people. But that doesn't mean we need to walk into a noose.
Amen. Amen.
Okay,
all right, well, let's go to our guests.
Excellent.
Do you want me to read the intros for once since I have them right here, or are you planning to do it?
Nope.
All right. Well, Congressman John Molinar represents Michigan's 2nd Congressional District and serves as chairman of the House Select Committee on the Strategic Competition between the United States and the Chinese Communist Party. He also serves as Michigan's senior member on the House Appropriations Committee and co-chair of the School Choice Caucus. And prior to joining the House, he served in the Michigan State Senate and the Michigan House of Representatives. Congressman Raja Krishnamurthy, and it's funny, he told a great story that one day he was giving a speech and he had introduced himself and somebody said to him, "So your name is Roger Christian Murphy?"
That was awesome.
But that's how I remembered how to pronounce his name. He represents Illinois' 8th Congressional District and serves as the ranking member of the House Select Committee on the Chinese Communist Party, making him the first South Asian American in history to lead a congressional committee. He also serves in the House Permanent Select Committee on Intelligence and the Committee on Oversight and Accountability.
Here's our interview. Or wait, I should say, here's Mark's interview.
American Enterprise Institute. I'm Mark Thiessen. It's been almost a quarter century since Congress approved permanent normal trade relations for the People's Republic of China and paved the way for China's entry into the WTO. This resulted in a dramatic expansion of trade and investment between the United States and the PRC. The hope at the time was that the trade would, over time, help democratize China, create incentives for the Chinese Communist Party to open up its society and play by the rules of the rules-based international order. Instead, the opposite has happened. China has become more repressive, not less. It used its access to trade and investment to steal U.S. intellectual property. It's used its wealth produced by bilateral trade and investment to build up its military might. And rather than becoming a force for liberalization, U.S. businesses have become de facto foreign agents for China, lobbying Congress against things such as a ban on slave labor. And America has become increasingly dependent on China for key strategic sectors from telecommunications to pharmaceuticals. But perhaps the greatest concern is the one we're here to discuss today, which is that many Chinese companies operating here in the United States have effectively become Trojan horses for the Chinese Communist Party, embedding themselves in our supply chains, lying in wait, ready to be activated in the event of a Sino-American crisis.
China has reportedly targeted our telecommunications, our energy, water, banking systems, health, and other critical infrastructure. That's the bad news. The good news is that the pandemic has awoken the American people to this growing threat, and in a period of unprecedented partisan acrimony in our country, Republicans and Democrats on Capitol Hill are actually working together in an unprecedented bipartisan fashion to confront this danger. And if you want proof, look no further than this stage. We are pleased today to welcome both the Republican chairman and the Democratic ranking member of the House Select Committee on Strategic Competition between the United States and the Chinese Communist Party, who are appearing together to discuss the danger posed by certain Chinese companies operating here in the United States. Congressman John Molinar represents Michigan's 2nd Congressional District and serves as the chairman of the House Select Committee on the Chinese Communist Party. He also serves as Michigan's senior member of the House Appropriations Committee and co-chair of the School Choice Caucus. And prior to joining the House, he served in Michigan State Senate and Michigan State House of Representatives. Congressman Raja Krishnamurthy represents Illinois' 8th Congressional District and serves as ranking member of the committee, making him the first South Asian American in history to lead a congressional committee. He also serves on the House Permanent Select Committee on Intelligence and the Committee on Oversight and Accountability. Each will give brief remarks, and then we'll have a bipartisan conversation. So please first give a warm AEI welcome to Congressman John Molinar.
Well, thank you, Mark, and good morning, everyone. And I want to thank AEI and also my good friend Raja Krishnamurthy. He is truly a great teammate in this fight, and it's been an honor to lead this committee alongside you, so thank you. For almost 2 years now, the Select Committee has taken bipartisan action to safeguard our national security against threats from companies spanning different industries that are closely linked to the Chinese Communist Party. From TikTok controlling the news Americans consume and storing their personal data, to biotech company BGI stealing America's genetic data, to the surveillance risk posed by drone company DJI, this committee and many in the U.S. government are finally recognizing that Chinese companies operating in the U.S. pose a tremendous risk to our national security. And just one statistic that I found interesting on this is, just in the last few weeks, we learned that 39% of adults under 30 regularly get their news from TikTok. That's up from 9% in 2020. Yet even broader growing awareness of the threat, when the Select Committee has raised concerns over malign PRC companies, all too often the first thing we hear is, where is the smoking gun? Allies, policymakers, and the public understandably want to see evidence of malign behavior before acting. Looking for a smoking gun, though, is the wrong way to think about the China-related risk. After all, a smoking gun means a shot has already been fired. Demanding to see smoking guns before taking action puts policymakers into a reactive posture. When our country's leaders have failed to connect the dots and take action, there have been catastrophic consequences, including Pearl Harbor and 9/11. Even when we have lucked into less dire consequences, as was the case with both Huawei and semiconductors, being late to the game is expensive. With emergency legislative solutions such as the so-called rip and replace costing billions in taxpayer dollars. That is strategically unwise and financially ruinous. Consequently, I would like to spend some time outlining why we need to be looking not so much for smoking guns, but instead loaded guns. Chinese companies that, because of the technology they provide or the supply chains they impact, pose an unacceptable risk to our country's security. Even Chinese companies that claim to be private may be called upon by the party to advance its interests at the expense of ours at any time for any reason through the CCP's national security law. Since its formation, our committee has been working overtime to identify and disarm these loaded guns, but the more we dig, the more we uncover. There is no more prominent example of a loaded gun than the Chinese national champion digital communications conglomerate Huawei. It was Huawei's scale and scope that first caused the House Intelligence Committee to raise the red flag as far back as 2012. In retrospect, over a decade later, the threat posed by Huawei should have been obvious. However, the government was slow to respond. National security suffered, and taxpayers have paid the price. To counter threats posed by Huawei and similar PRC telecommunications companies, Congress passed the Secure and Trusted Communications Networks Act in 2020, which, among other things, created a rip and replace program to remove Huawei and other Chinese gear from our nation's networks. 4.5 years later, rip and replace efforts are still ongoing, and the taxpayer bill is close to $5 billion and counting. Even worse, we have failed to learn from the Huawei example. Our national security and our fiscal health demand we disarm these loaded guns before it's too late. Too many Chinese companies are deeply embedded in some of our most critical industries and supply chains. Given the signal from the CCP and situations ranging from a diplomatic slight to a Taiwan invasion, these companies could use their supply chain leverage against us to a devastating effect. Take, for example, the BGI Group, formerly known as Beijing Genomics Institute. Today, BGI operates over 100 laboratories across the world and collects copious amounts of patient data, including genetic data. BGI operates the world's largest gene bank, and through its subsidiary, MGI, it is rapidly becoming a global provider of genetic sequencers. Much like Huawei, BGI is a national champion that has used stolen intellectual property and market subsidization to rapidly become a global biotech powerhouse that threatens our supply chains and national security. BGI is a loaded gun. In the world of semiconductors, we have Semiconductor Manufacturing International Corporation, or SMIC, which is currently one of the world's largest producers of legacy semiconductors, with ambitions of becoming a world leader in cutting-edge semiconductor production by the end of this decade. As you all know, semiconductors are the lifeblood of our modern economy, from computers to our cars, as well as nearly every defense system. So the idea that we should allow a company like SMIC to grow and further infiltrate our market would be economic and national security suicide. SMIC is a loaded gun. Another Chinese firm, ZPMC, is the world's largest producer of ship-to-shore cranes, operating in ports across the globe. ZPMC has collaborated with the Chinese Army and worked with entities sanctioned by the US government. Yet unbelievably, ZPMC accounts for nearly 80% of ship-to-shore cranes in operation at US ports. In a recently released joint investigation with the House Homeland Security, we uncovered unauthorized cellular modems installed on its cranes bound for US ports, creating a significant backdoor security vulnerability. ZPMC could disrupt US maritime equipment and technology at the request of the Chinese government, including during a conflict over Taiwan. ZPMC is a loaded gun. Going forward, we need to be asking whether a given company, through its technology or supply chain reach, could provide the CCP with the ability to threaten our national or economic security interests. If the answer is yes, we need to act with the presumption that the company in question will one day be used by the CCP to threaten our national security. And then we need to take appropriate steps to proactively stop the threat. The Chinese government, through its actions, has foreclosed the opportunity for Chinese companies to receive the benefit of the doubt. So how do we get ahead of the problem? I would suggest 3 key steps. First, for the sake of our national security, we need to implement appropriate barriers to our market, particularly in strategic sectors, to prevent malign PRC companies from undermining U.S. technology and undercutting American businesses. We must also leverage and build upon crucial existing authorities to ensure PRC tech products from LiDAR to genetic sequencers do not gain access to our sensitive data or critical infrastructure. This includes expanding CFIUS jurisdiction to include foreign companies entering critical U.S. industries. Following the same logic it currently uses to assess national security risk when it comes to transactions, CFIUS should be assessing whether allowing a Chinese entity to enter a sensitive sector of the U.S. economy could pose a risk to our national security. Second, we need to cut off access to U.S. technology and capital that fuels PRC national champions in critical sectors. By enacting outbound investment restrictions and stronger export controls, we can stop fueling our own demise. We cannot outrun the CCP if we're providing the wind at its back. Finally, while we lead, we must also coordinate with our allies and encourage them to mirror these steps and secure their own supply chains, technology, and domestic markets. We will need relentless diplomacy and constant reinforcement to bring our allies aboard. Now, I understand this task will be difficult, but the real choice before us is not between business as usual and taking hard steps. The true choice is whether we dictate the terms of de-risking our economic relationship with China and guard against these loaded guns now on our own terms, or wait until the CCP forces our hand. It could be an invasion of Taiwan. It could be a retaliatory economic measure. It could be because Xi Jinping woke up on the wrong side of the bed. Given the CCP's track record, sooner or later this bill will come due. I have no doubt we will rise to this moment, but there's not a second to lose. It's time to get to work. Thank you, and I'd now like to turn it over to my good friend, Ranking Member Raja Krishnamurthy.
Good morning. It's an honor to be with you, and as I like to say, it's an honor to be any place they can pronounce my name right. This is a true story. I think I've mentioned this to John before and Mark. When I first ran for office in Illinois, I said, "Hi, my name is Raja Krishnamurthy." And the person in Chicago looked right back at me and said, "Roger Christian Murphy. Very nice to meet you." And then he said, "I didn't know the Irish made it to India." And so, in any case, look, I don't want to repeat all the points, the excellent points that John made. I associate myself with his comments, but I'll just make 3 quick points. First of all, I want to say thank you to AEI for hosting us and allowing us to have this exchange. It's extremely important. I see so many people who I've seen at previous engagements who are so attentive to the issues involved with the competition between the US and the Chinese Communist Party. It's wonderful to see you again. Second point is, it's so important that John and I do as many of these events as possible because some people have not seen a Democrat and a Republican together as of late, certainly not talking about these issues. And I think a lot of credit goes to former Speaker Kevin McCarthy as well as Hakeem Jeffries for coming together, creating a committee that is seriously devoted to tackling the very important issues associated with the strategic competition. I'll always remember the first day that we all got together in that committee. John, you might remember we got together in former Speaker McCarthy's conference room, which is this cavernous room about the size of this room here. And we met at the conference table. And interestingly, Kevin McCarthy was sitting at one end of the table, and to his immediate left was none other than Hakeem Jeffries. And that never happens in the Capitol for a private meeting of legislators to come together being addressed by the Speaker and the Minority Leader at the same time. But the message was very clear from Kevin McCarthy. He said, look, if you want to do politics, we've got committees for that. But if you want to get something done, then you're in the right room. And that's exactly what we as a committee have tried to do over the last 2 years, and in a number of areas. Obviously today we're going to talk about supply chains. We're going to talk about, as you said, loaded guns that might be embedded in those supply chains. But just so you know, we also deal with issues of national security and military preparedness, as well as other aspects of our technological competition and the economic competition. The third and final point is, I just want to point out to you why a Chinese company is unlike any other entity that we have seen, at least in my experience, competing, I put in air quotes, in the United States in providing goods and services. There are two reasons. One is under the 1993 company law in the People's Republic of China, every single company has a CCP cell embedded at the top management of the corporation to basically run the company, to inform the management of how to make sure that whatever it does complies with what the CCP wants. The second aspect, which is more recent, is a series of laws that have come forth basically in the form of the national security law, for instance, and others, where these companies must be the instrument of the CCP with regard to foreign intelligence collection. So in the case of Huawei, for instance, because Huawei is a Chinese company, obviously it has a CCP cell embedded in the top management, and because it has reach around the world, it's embedded in various telecommunication systems, it is required to provide a backdoor into its products for the CCP and its intelligence services should they want to, for instance, eavesdrop or surveil or gather information or collect intelligence on their adversaries or anybody. And this has been done. It may be a loaded gun for some, but it's been a smoking gun in other places. And so that is why we are concerned. And that is why we are taking the steps that we are. Now, above all of this is the fact that we are in a competition. We do have closely intertwined supply chains to the extent that now we have, I think, a record amount of trade, bilateral trade happening between the United States and China. And so we have to obviously be cognizant of that, even at the same time that we take steps to protect ourselves, protect our values, and make sure that we can compete. So with that, I'll just stop, and I just want to say thank you again for your attention. I look forward to the dialogue. Thank you.
Thank you so much for those great remarks. On your point about the CCP cells in the companies, I remember in the early 90s, after that law had been passed, I visited Shanghai GM with a congressional staff delegation, and they gave us a tour of the facility, and he said, this is the office of the head of the Chinese Communist Party here. And he said, it's kind of, and we were all looking like, why do you have a member of the Chinese Communist Party? And this is an American company, right? And he said, well, it's sort of like having a really enthusiastic member of the Republican or Democratic Party in your office. And I said, oh, do you have a member of the Chinese Democratic Party here too? But, being a smartass. Are you saying that like Chinese companies here in the United States have CCP people like embedded in them in the US, or is it back home directing them?
Back home. So a good example is BYD, for instance. BYD has CCP cells that are embedded in the company. Really, they meet even at the factory level, not just at the corporate level. And another example is Wuxi AppTech. They have, I think, 1,000 out of the 7,000 employees in China are members of the CCP, and many of those people are part of the CCP cell. And so it used to be at one time that these CCP cells, they kind of existed in name only, but they didn't necessarily exercise a lot of control over the companies. But in the Xi Jinping era, that has changed. Xi Jinping has made sure that these companies' CCP cells not just be present, but also help to exercise control and flex their muscles.
Just to add, that's a great point. So in my case, in my district, there is a battery plant, Goshen, that is trying to locate in Michigan in my district. And when you hear about something like that, at first you're very excited. Oh, there's going to be new jobs. Well, then you find out, okay, the parent company that's based in China has right in its Articles of Association basically allegiance to the Chinese Communist Party. And it's very interesting because the spokesperson of Goshen in the United States said there's no connection of that this is a separate entity. But then you find out there's, the leader of the Chinese company, the relative is the CEO of the US company, and he used the same example. It's like having a Republican and a Democrat. We don't talk politics. But you realize their national security laws require allegiance and doing the bidding of the Chinese Communist Party, not simply in China, but also here in the United States. They view these laws as across the board. And so that sets up a direct, when I studied business, it was the goal of the company, maximize shareholder wealth or value. When you think about what their mission statements is, carry out the mission of the Chinese Communist Party. And this idea that there's a firewall, it reminds me of when the TikTok CEO came and said, they would never allow American data to be in some way transmitted. Well, turned out that was a false statement. And the reality is, if you walk it back, you realize if the CCP ever asked him for American data, would he go to prison for the rest of his life in order to protect our data? I don't think so.
Yeah.
So it's a very serious concern. It's a very different business structure than anything we've dealt with in the past, and it's throughout our supply chains.
Well, you raised a fascinating point, because I remember there was a big fight back in the 2016 when the San Bernardino bomber, his Apple cell phone was locked, and the FBI wanted to get into it, and Apple went to court to fight. To protect it. Is that even conceivable with the Chinese company, that they would resist, the orders of the Chinese Communist Party?
I don't believe so. In fact, it's just the opposite. Raja and I just had a hearing on lawfare where American university professors are being sued because they have published or spoken out against the Chinese Communist Party. And their universities are hesitating to defend them in this. So you see this chilling effect that it has across our free speech rights.
So you've identified a number of PRC bad actors, from Huawei to TikTok to BGI. Is every PRC company a threat that's doing business here in the United States? Are there good Chinese companies and bad Chinese companies, or is the system just built in a way that we need to consider all these companies a threat?
I think that's a great question. I don't see that. I don't see them all as threats. I think that the way that I look at it is, like, if you're selling ramen noodles, or you're selling diapers, or you're selling consumer products, or items that aren't of great strategic interest or vital interest to the country, I don't think we should spend a lot of time consumed by, okay, is this going to be a threat or not, despite the fact that a CCP cell may be embedded in their corporation back in China. Okay, I get that. It's in these, especially those 10 strategic sectors that Xi Jinping has identified as ones where they need to occupy the commanding heights. That's where I see the biggest risks. So for instance, aviation and drones, shipbuilding, in telecommunications, in quantum computing, in so many areas that are crucial not only for our economic security, but our national security. If they were to, for instance, own the entire legacy semiconductor space, we know that they're already trying to own the advanced semiconductor chip space, where we're trying to deny our technology to help fuel their modernization. But if they were to own the entire legacy, the old chip space, that would still hurt us, because a lot of those chips go into our ships, go into our airplanes, go into our missile systems. And so that's where we have to be super careful, and we have to make sure that Chinese companies are not so important to the defense supply chain, for instance, that were they to either deny us access to that technology or somehow embed malware in that technology, that we would be harmed.
So in the past week, Americans have been transfixed by the news of exploding Hezbollah pagers in Lebanon. And in ways we still don't fully understand, Israel was able to insert itself into the supply chain and sell Hezbollah thousands of pagers compromised with explosives. Then when the pagers blew up, Hezbollah turned to walkie-talkies, and it turned out that Israel had inserted itself into that supply chain as well, and those started blowing up. If the good guys can exploit the supply chain in this way, the bad guys can too, right? What is the danger of the Chinese Communist Party trying to do something similar here in America in the event of a contingency over Taiwan, or if things got heated with us in some military scenario?
Hold on, let me take my phone out for a second. Go ahead.
Put that right there.
I'll just put that right here.
You want to hold on to that for him?
You know, it's interesting when you look at our dependency on Chinese drones, for instance. I think 80% of the drones that, we're using, even in law enforcement, other areas, we're dependent on China. So that's a concern. When you look at the cranes that I mentioned earlier, they installed a cellular modem on these cranes that, is communicating information. It also has the ability to do other things, to monitor what's coming in and out and potentially to shut down operations. So I think we always have to be mindful of that. I just to follow up on, I think it's degrees of risk. So when you look at like Shein and Temu, right? You say, okay, they're advertising on the Super Bowl, what's the risk there? Well, then you start looking at their supply chains connected to Xinjiang and forced labor. So to what degree do we want to be complicit in that in this country? But then you also look at our policies where we maybe don't inspect certain packages that come in and they aren't really, and then you realize, there's fentanyl coming into our country. And, our committee did a report that showed that not only is China simply negligent in allowing fentanyl precursors to be manufactured in China, they're actually subsidizing it through their tax policy for the creation of these chemical precursors for fentanyl that's killing 200 Americans a day. And, they would say at the same time Xi Jinping is meeting with President Biden saying, we'll cooperate with you on your drug problem. They're subsidizing it and encouraging it. So we have to recognize that, to me that was shocking. Bill Barr, when he testified in our committee, said, we always suspected that, but this is the first hard evidence that we've seen of that. So in that case, there was a smoking gun.
So let's talk about the cranes for a second, because that was new and interesting information. We all saw the supply chain disruptions during COVID, when the ports were in Los Angeles were closed, and there was a traffic jam of ships, going out into the Pacific, and where they all of a sudden, you couldn't get baby formula. There were all sorts of sidon effects to the American people. Could China use those cellular networks to literally shut down our ports? Well, and if they control 80%, how did we get to the point where China was allowed to build 80% of the cranes coming into our that we use in our country?
That's the concern. I think, look, I don't know if they're going to be exploding any pagers or cell phones, but I think that, we know Operation Volt Typhoon is well documented at this point. It was publicized. For those of you who missed it, Operation Volt Typhoon was an effort, or is an effort, by the CCP to basically implant malware in critical pieces of infrastructure throughout the United States. We're talking about power grids, we're talking about utilities, we're talking about water systems, we're talking about ports. And essentially, it's not meant in that case to collect intelligence. That was the interesting thing that General Nakasone had made clear at our hearing. It's to disrupt those pieces of infrastructure should a conflict arise. It's kind of the exploding pager on steroids, turning off the power to Fort Hood because there's like malware implanted in some power grids near certain bases in Texas, for instance. And so we have to assume, I personally think you have to assume the worst, hope for the best, and plan for the worst. And that's kind of what we're talking about here. It turned out, by the way, in Operation Volt Typhoon, one of the most fascinating things is they were using ordinary routers that businesses buy all the time, utilities buy, things that you can buy off the shelf, and these routers had a vulnerability, which they could then use to implant the malware into the networks of those utilities. So, we're talking about very sophisticated operations, and that's why we are trying to unravel it, say, okay, let's stop buying TSP routers, for instance. Let's get smart about this. Let's cooperate at the federal, state, and local levels, along with private corporations, because everybody it has to be a team effort. You can't just focus on one or the other, because the weakest link could be the entry point. And so that's the challenge, but also kind of what we have to do.
And recently the Commerce Department put out some new rules, and I want to commend them for doing that. Gina Raimondo, what it did is looked at autonomous vehicles and the ability to, I first started hearing this a year or so ago about their ability to really, map out information and collect data. And the threats that, there were like 8 of the 10 companies doing the research in California on these autonomous vehicles were Chinese. And they're mapping all this information, and, we're just kind of allowing them. They don't allow that in China for our companies to be doing that. And the one feedback I would give on the process is we need to be more aggressive and more proactive when it comes to LiDAR, some of the drones, different things where we are at tremendous risk, and it feels like we're always reacting. We're finding out what they're doing and then trying to prevent it after it's happening.
Yeah. What is the impact on the U.S. Navy, particularly in Guam, which would be critical for resupplying of the U.S. military in Taiwan and a contingency over Taiwan? Are Guam's ports and airfields and electric grid under threat from this?
Yes, it was part of one of the targets, okay? And so that was something that we've kind of taken up as well in the committee, and I think that the Armed Services Committee is now kind of working on this as well. I visited Guam during a little notice trip by Nancy Pelosi to Taiwan a couple of years ago. It's really fascinating. I don't know if any of you have gone to Guam, but I'm sure you have, Mark and John. We have 10,000 troops there. We have a large installation there, and the defenses there are crucial in the Indo-Pacific region. And of course, the CCP knows that, and that's why they target Guam.
Yeah. One thing, just along the lines, we recently went to South Korea and Japan, and it's going to be very important that we continue to build these relationships with like-minded countries. And I would say our relationship with Japan and their relationship with South Korea has never been stronger, and I think more and more countries are awaking to this threat and wanting to partner with the United States. So to me, that's, I know we're talking about a lot of challenging things right now, but to me, that's a huge encouragement to see these, seeing the Philippines and how they have these concerns and wanting to partner with the United States.
If they're doing it to us, they're probably doing it to Taiwan too, right?
Oh, yeah.
Do you think that the CCP has played this same playbook within Taiwan with all the bilateral investment between them? Are all Taiwan's ports dependent on Chinese cranes? Or how could that play out in a contingency?
Yeah, I think that this is something that, without getting into the classified information, we share a lot of intelligence with the Taiwanese in terms of what we know about their own vulnerabilities. And you're absolutely right. I think that they are right on the front lines of being targeted in so many different ways. One is through what you said, potentially cranes, but also their cyber vulnerabilities are well known. And so we have to kind of almost assume that Taiwan would be subject to the exact same and perhaps more intense kinds of attacks should a conflict break out.
There's a movie that just came out, or is about to come out, a TV series in Taiwan called 0 Day, which is to set the country on fire. It's a depiction of what would happen in a Chinese attack and how the ATMs stop working and the whole economy gets crushed at that. It's frightening, but could that happen here?
I think, what is it? Art imitates reality.
Yeah.
One thing I would just say on Taiwan, we were in Taiwan and had a chance to meet with the new president shortly after their elections. And what we heard over and over again is the bombardment from the CCP trying to influence their elections. They had a clear favorite in the presidential election, and the Taiwanese people actually chose a different candidate, which I thought was very interesting because they were just being, the cyber issues and the intense campaign they were doing. And so to me, that's just one symptom of a much larger issue. And when it comes to the electronic arena, they're a tremendous risk.
I think that I don't see them, invading California, but I do see a scenario where they could miscalculate and preemptively attack a place like Guam. I think this is the concern that we have with regard to Xi Jinping or the PLA, which is that somehow they miscalculate in a situation and then they preemptively take actions that could lead to a catastrophic series of events. And so we need to up our deterrence game as much as possible and make it clear exactly what's going to happen, as well as be prepared along with our friends, partners, and allies to discourage conflict.
How hard is it to undo these things once they've happened? So we now found out that 80% of our cranes are from China, many embedded with these cellular, essentially controls that can be, remote controlled from Beijing. I understand President Biden has imposed 25% tariffs now on Chinese-made cranes. We're spending about $20 billion to replace them. How long does it take to build a U.S. crane manufacturing industrial base? And also, how many areas do we have to do this in? Like, where are the areas where we stupidly over the last quarter century allowed China to become the party on which we're dependent, and we're now discovering that we need a domestic industrial base to produce the things that we've been depending on China for because we wanted to do it at lower cost? And how much is it going to cost us to do that if there's even the will to do it?
Well, I think you make a great point, and you'd like to see this manufacturing here in the United States, and that should be the first priority. However, we also need to partner with our allies and recognize that we can't do this alone, and it's going to require leadership to build those alliances. And by the way, it's a great opportunity for us as a country in a bipartisan way to reach out to other nations who have actually felt neglected by the United States because so much was going to China. And we have an opportunity to kind of realign with other nations that are more like-minded, and at the same time counter what China's doing through their Belt and Road Initiative, is trying to co-opt other countries, create debt, and then leverage that for dual-use purposes. So I think there is a challenge there, but there's also a great opportunity.
I think that I'd start with the defense industry, number one. We actually had an interesting talk by some experts with regard to the defense supply chains and making sure that our defense architecture is sound. And then I think that you go from there. In terms of the cost, I don't know. But at the same time, we, the federal government, it turns out we spend money. Some people say we spend too much, but in any case, we spend money, and through our procurement itself, we can help to incentivize, kind of a supply chain from trusted partners, right? That's why the Biosecure Act, in my opinion, is so important, because instead of buying genomic sequencing machines from BGI or goods and services from Wuxi Aptec, both of those companies, in my opinion, are untrusted partners. We are basically saying, look, we're not going to do that anymore with taxpayer dollars. We're going to use it on other companies that are not foreign adversary controlled. And so that will help to stand up a biotech supply chain over time, not instantly, but over time, that we can trust, and hopefully that can compete well on its own around the world.
Let's go through quickly, sort of lightning round, a couple of these areas where the Chinese are investing heavily and why it's a threat to us. So, what is the danger? You talked about BGI and the genomic, genomic. What is the danger of China owning so much genomic data of Americans?
Wow. So basically what they're trying to do is two things, at least, that we know of. One is that they are trying to refine their own genetic models to be able to identify, for instance, certain minorities that they can persecute in China, for instance, the Uyghurs. They're trying to identify exactly what strands of DNA are associated with Uyghurs be able to segregate them and then persecute them, okay? The other thing, which is even more scary, but there's been evidence of this, is they're using it for military purposes. One, they're trying to create super soldiers in China, which means they're trying to mitigate the things that they may not like in their soldiers, like, for instance, wanting to sleep, being able to operate at high altitudes and so forth. They're actually doing experiments with DNA to try to refine that and mitigate against it. And then the other thing, which is even scarier, is trying to identify weaknesses in certain ethnicities or peoples using their DNA.
For bioweapons?
Yes.
Or for, yeah.
And then maybe weaponizing that weakness, right? And that's a much scarier proposition, but unfortunately we can't put it past the CCP this moment.
What's the threat from our dependence on Chinese drones?
Well, I think it's, you just look at what's happening in Ukraine and you see the significance of drones when you think of the situation with Taiwan, the importance of that. And when you consider, when you have 80% of the drones being used in America, manufactured by Chinese, that is a dangerous vulnerability. And so information gathering and other aspects are very concerning.
Why is China buying American farmland, and what threat does that pose?
Well, first of all, I coming from a rural district, I've always believed we need, food security is national security. And I think one of the main concerns I have is often they will buy land near military bases. So, that's something we need to be vigilant, because often you'll hear about these gate crashing incidents and trying to get information on our military. But to me, we need to have a strong agricultural base so that, we keep our food supply.
China is now the largest foreign investor in U.S. shale gas sector. What's going on there?
Well, interestingly, so China has a lot of vulnerabilities. One is food, right? They just can't grow enough. They can't grow enough food domestically to feed their population, and that's why they steal intellectual property associated with food, for instance. We had a hearing on that in Iowa, of all places, to talk about this with Ashley Hinson's district. On the shale gas, the other vulnerability they have is they have to import their energy. They are dramatically dependent on foreign sources of energy. We know this, obviously. They import tremendous amounts of crude from Russia as well as the Middle East, and they want to be able to develop their own sources of energy abroad, but they also want to get access to that technology to develop that crude or the natural gas, exploit that abroad. Now, the flip side of that is, again, we just always have to be thinking about worst case scenario, which is if they were to embed themselves in a energy supply chain, what could they do at that point? And so you just have to be thinking about that. I'm sure CFIUS has to think about that as well. Should they invest in shale gas here in the U.S.?
And just to add, I think our energy policy, we need to really be thinking of how we can have a strong energy policy that's not dependent on China. It's not playing on their home field.
Yeah.
Because I feel like this is an area where we've really enabled them to lead in battery technology, and then our policies are actually forcing American companies in a further dependence on China. Yeah. And so to me, that's a key area, and I think they're exploiting every advantage they have without any consequences for that.
Without bringing politics into this, right now, America has the capacity to be energy independent when it comes to fossil fuels, whereas China is deeply vulnerable and deeply dependent on us and on the Western world for oil to fuel its economy. Yet we're making this big push towards electric vehicles, which would effectively reverse the dependence, whereas China would be much more independent when it comes to EVs, and we would be dependent on them for the rare earths and other supplies for the batteries. Is this push to mandate EVs, it may make sense from a climate change perspective, but does it make sense from a national security perspective?
Are you looking at me, Mark?
Yes.
You want me to answer that?
Okay, so I think it's both. Because I think that, interestingly, the EV market is exploding around the world at this point. And so for us to be a part of the EV market around the world, we need to have the best technology. It turns out we don't have the best technology right now in the EV space. I think it's going to be a transition. Right now, China has the best EV technology, okay? And then I think over time, I think we're going to learn and then innovate, and then we will have the best EV technology in the world. And then we will outcompete everyone in the EV space globally. But it's a transition. At the same time, I think with regard to what you talked about in the mandates and stuff, look, I think this is an ongoing challenge. I happen to have a Ford Escape hybrid, and so I got 1 foot in each space at this point, 230,000 miles and going, and so I'm gonna keep 1 foot in each space for a little while here.
That's a good national policy too.
There you go, a hybrid policy.
I really believe that forcing our automakers' hand on this has been a huge mistake.
Yeah.
And I believe that right now our energy policy is really benefiting China and hurting America. And to me, I love innovation. I have confidence in American ingenuity, but when they are forced to rely on critical minerals where China has the dominant supply chain, when they have battery technology, and they're not able to just spend the time and develop the best technology, but to comply with an artificial mandate for government, I think is putting our competitive advantage seriously at risk.
Let's take a question or two from the audience.
WTO, MFN, we essentially have financed and provided the technology for China's rise, right? I believe that given their debt situation, given how they're structured, they need that to continue in order to continue to grow. So we've been in a reactive posture, as you've said. How do we get onto a front foot that prevents Western technology and prevents our companies from financing the very system that is taking us down?
Well, one of the things we are working on, and believe this is very important, is an outbound, and so to me, that is going to be vital, because when you look at it, we are actually funding our demise. And there are all these different lists that you can work on with different companies that can be banned. But China's very creative in terms of changing names of companies. There are different sectors that are emerging sectors that we need to really be paying attention to. So in my view, we have to have an outbound investment regime that basically says, no investment in these businesses that are on some kind of a list that says we shouldn't be helping the Chinese military, we shouldn't be supporting genocide, and have those lists be very clear, and at the same time recognize that in these areas, strategic technology that has dual use applications, that we prevent that, and then at the same time encouraging American investment in like-minded countries. So that's a complicated area. I would say our committee, that's probably our number one priority right now, and I know the speaker has said he would like to have something before the end of the year, an outbound investment legislation. But it's complicated because our economies are so intertwined. We want to get it right, so that's more important than getting it done next week.
So we found out during the course of this investigation that our own thrift savings plan, I don't know if you're familiar with that, TSP, that's our 401k basically. John and I assume, most employees, including people in the military, are in the TSP. And it turned out that it was invested in these very companies that we were concerned about with the military modernization in China. And so thanks to our investigation, I mean, when I told, you said WTO, my constituents were like, WTF, what are you doing? You're investing our money in that stuff? And so so the TSP board took those investments off the list. Yes. Thanks to our investigation.
And one report we just put out was looking at university research collaboration and Department of Defense dollars going to fund over 9,000 joint papers between Chinese and American researchers in some of these critical technologies that have defense applications. And then also looking at these joint institutes where we're funding this with our own taxpayer dollars for military purposes, where the other entity is actually partnering with the People's Liberation Army. So fortunately, 2 universities have stepped up and said basically they're going to discontinue that. We hope more will follow that course, but we're very intertwined and we need to strategically address that.
Can I just say in closing that this is a very partisan period in time in our country. There's a lot of, we're a few weeks away from an election. There's a lot of people who sort of despair about the partisanship in our country. And I just want to say how wonderful it is to see a senior Democrat and a senior Republican standing here arm in arm defending our country against a major threat. And so thank you very much for what you're doing, and thank you for coming here to AEI.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
So can I tell you what I loved about this? I laid out at the start of this all the bad news, and we heard a lot of bad news in the conversation. But the good news is that, one, the pandemic, I think, has awoken Americans in a bipartisan fashion to the threat posed by the Chinese Communist Party in a way that I think didn't exist before the pandemic. And second of all, we've got Republicans and Democrats on Capitol Hill working in a bipartisan way to confront it. I think this House Select Committee is absolutely the best of Congress. The fact that these 2 members, a Republican and a Democrat, one of them from a swing state that's very contested, are willing to sit down at AEI, a conservative think tank, a few weeks before one of the most hotly contested elections and present a bipartisan front in the face of the Chinese Communist Party. I just think it shows how seriously our country takes this problem and that we can come together on important things, not just side issues, but really fundamental issues to our country.
No, I agree with you wholeheartedly. I think the China Select Committee is the best of Congress. I will say this, okay, and you and I know this as sort of insiders. I think that a committee like that always has problems because it steps on
doesn't have line authority.
Right, and it has steps on jurisdictions, steps on House Foreign Affairs, steps on House Banking, steps on House Appropriations, steps on Armed Services, and if there's one thing that Republicans and Democrats can also agree on, it's don't step on my turf. And it's for that reason that I really hope that even if Republicans lose the House, that Hakeem Jeffries maintains the committee. He said he would earlier on. He said when McCarthy stepped down, he said that he would keep the committee, but he has not repeated that. And I worry that if the Democrats take over, that as Speaker, he will in fact be talked out of it for a whole variety of reasons. Some of them, frankly, a little bit scary.
Like what?
So one thing that I heard, and I think I've talked about this with you too, is that there were Democrats, not these guys on the committee, but more on the fringe of the party, the Hamas lovers, et cetera, that believed that Republicans were beating the drums for war with China, and that this committee was an instrument for that, and that it was a mistake for Democrats to go along with that, and therefore the committee shouldn't exist. And I was hearing that not just from the fringes in the House, but also from some of the fringies in the White House.
That's interesting. Well, I will tell you this. I was very encouraged by the story. I think it was Molinar who described the first meeting when they sat down with Hakeem Jeffries and Speaker McCarthy at the time. Basically said, if you guys want to play politics, there's a lot of other committees to do that. This is not the place to do that. This is the place where we get things done. There were not a lot of times when they sat down together in front of a bipartisan group of members and presented a united front. And so... And, this was before the era of good feelings with Speaker Johnson. I mean, McCarthy was reviled by the Democrats, where now
they miss him now.
Well, yes, that's probably true. So that was an unusual moment for Congress, and I hope it presages that they will keep this committee going because it's the best thing Congress has going. And quite frankly, it's a model for what we should be doing in a lot of areas.
I agree with you wholeheartedly. If we could only agree that there are priorities that we need to address, China, Russia, Iran, on foreign policy, maybe we could get something done as opposed to spending all day tweeting. But, that's just a pipe dream on my part. Anyway, I thought this was a great event and really urge all of our listeners to pay attention to what's coming out of the committee, to pay attention to the work that Dan Blumenthal and Fred Kagan are doing in this space as well, which is really, really excellent and important. And thank you for being with us.
Talk to you next week.
Take care.
Let us know what topics you'd like us to cover. You can get in touch with the show by emailing us at whatthehell@aei.org.
Or you can reach us on Twitter. I'm at @dpletka.
And I'm at Mark Thiessen. That's Mark with a C.
Please rate and review the podcast. If you like the show, please subscribe, share it, comment on Apple Podcasts, or wherever you're listening to this.
Thanks for listening.